Today I'm going to talk about hacking your Glebe pants into pants with a flat waistband at the front and pleats. So this is a design that's maybe a little bit more work appropriate, a little less casual. I hacked this particular pair actually from a pair of Glebe pants that I already made in the elasticated waist. So these were actually the pants that I did in the sew along. And then I just wasn't really reaching for them because I used a fairly a suiting weight fabric, and I just wasn't really loving the way it worked with the elastic waist. So I decided to change it into a flat waist, and I wanted to show you how to do that. The fabric I chose for today's hack is a mystery fabric. So this is a thrifted fabric. I found it at the thrift store. It's some sort of suiting. I did a burn test which was fairly inconclusive because I think it's a blend. So it presses and behaves like a wool, but when the burn test there definitely was some polyester in there. So my guess is it's a poly wool blend. Anyway, that's what I'm going to use today. I'm also going to show you how to fully line these pants so you get a really nice fully lined work appropriate pant that you can make in a lovely wool or a wool blend or another suiting fabric. So let's go ahead and get started. So I have my pattern pieces here. This is my front pattern piece. The most important thing you need to figure out is how much ease you already have in the waist of these pants. Now, it's really important when you change from a fully elastic waist to a half elastic waist that you can pull your pants over your hips. You don't want them to get stuck on the way up. So the best way to do that is actually to measure the waist. So what you can do is take your back pocket piece and your front and line up the notches and find some tape. And just tape that together. So what that does is it completes the front pattern piece because that back pocket piece is actually really part of the front. And then what you can do is mark in the stitching line. So you can see here I've marked it in. There's a 1/2 inch seam allowance at the center front. So I've marked that in here. There's a notch here to show us there. And there's a 1/2 inch on the side seam. And then the waist seam is a 1 centimeter seam. So I have just marked that in with this dotted line, you see. And then what I can do is go in with my tape measure. And I'm just going to go and measure along the stitching line. So that's really important that I'm along the stitching line. So this is the finished measurement of the pants, which is 13 3/8 of an inch. And I'll go ahead and do that on the back pattern piece as well. Okay, now I've done a little bit of back of the pattern piece math. So my front waist measurement was 13 3/8, and I can multiply that by 2 to find the front pattern piece all the way across finished, which is 26 3/4 of an inch. You'll have to forgive me because I'm really stuck in between imperial and metric, and I think about some things imperial and some things metric, and I'm really stuck halfway on this one because I kind of think about it in metric, but then I think about measurements in inches. Anyway, and then my back waist measurement was 14 6/8 or 3/4. If I multiply that by 2, I get 29.5, and then if I add the front and the back together, I get 56 1/4 inches. And I'm sorry if that's wrong. I think it's right. Anyway, for me, my hip is 54 inches. The very smallest I would want my finished hip measurement with the elastic fully stretched out would be 55 inches. So I have about 2 inches of wiggle room in there. Now, because it's so close to the, so close to that anyway, I'm just going to add in all of the pleats in myself. So I'm going to show you how I do that. So let's talk about what a pleat actually does to your pattern and your fabric. So here's a piece of paper, and you can see I've folded a pleat into it. So when I pleat this piece of paper, it becomes, the finished piece of paper becomes smaller. And if I draw a line here and here, when I open it out, you can see that this piece of paper has become smaller by this much, the amount that's folded into that pleat. So if I'm adding pleats to a garment, I need to add this much so that the finished garment measurement is the same as before I started altering that pattern piece. When you're choosing the amount of the depth of the pleats, I think it's important to stay proportional to your body shape. Now, I make pretty big pants, so I make pretty big pleats. So, you know, if you were pattern making for, you know, I don't know, like a 35-inch hip rather than a 54-inch hip or a larger hip, you would do much smaller pleats. So it's really proportional. So let's see how big the pleats are in this so you can get an idea. So this is a kind of, you know, I think it's a pretty proportional pleat, and I think it's about 1 inch. So I'm just going to slip this in here. So that's 1 inch behind and then 1 inch in front. So I need to add 2 inches to my pattern piece so I can do my pleats. So 2 inches on each side of the front. Okay, so I have my piece of paper, and I've actually made a mini pattern piece here. I'm going to zoom you in a bit. So here's my mini pattern piece. You can see I've drawn a line on my pattern piece that is parallel to my grain line. So I've drawn that line on here. So what you'll do is you get a very large piece of paper that is the same length as your current pattern piece, but a bit wider. I'm going to put my pattern piece down, and I am going to trace around my pattern piece up until that line, and I'm going to put a little mark there just to mark it. Okay, so I've traced around one side of the pattern piece to that line. The line is where I'm going to add that ease in. Now I'm going to put my ruler back over the top. Whoops, I moved it back. And mark that line onto my piece of paper. Then I'm going to mark another line perpendicular to this going across. Then I'm going to take this piece away. What I'm going to do now is draw in the rest of these lines. So fill them in. Okay, this is really what you do when you do manual grading. It's called the track method, and you kind of slide it along this track. What I'm now going to do is draw a second line parallel to this vertical one, and I need to add in 2 inches. So I'm going to draw it 2 inches this way. I'm going to draw it much bigger so you can see. So now I'm going to place that piece on. So that's where it originally was. And I'm going to move it over that 2 inches. So keeping this line along that track line and lining this line on my pattern piece up with the 2-inch line. So it's nicely lined up. Now I'm going to continue tracing around the other side of that pattern piece. I'm going to take it away and then blend those lines. So this bottom hemline is straight, so that's pretty easy. This top line here is also fairly straight. If it's not completely straight across, you can just blend it. There's not a whole lot of shaping in the front of the Glebe pants, so it is not going to matter too much where you add that. So you can see that I have added an extra 2 inches. So if I fold this, if I pleat this page, and I place my pattern piece back on, you can see that once it's pleated, it's going to be exactly the same size as the old pattern piece. So I also wanted to show you the really, really lazy way of doing this. What I've done is I've extended the grain line on my pants and I've traced around there using a pencil because this is a really light colored fabric. And I've marked it with a pin where I want to add the extra couple of inches. And then I've done the same thing down the bottom. And then I'm just going to mark where I want that to be. So 2 inches across. Okay, and I'm going to do the same thing in the bottom. And then I'm going to continue tracing around. So you can see that's added that 2 inches into my pattern piece there. So that is the cheat method. Anyway, so I have my pattern pieces. The key to the lining really is you just want to make a pair of pants without pockets in it. So we just have to create a front piece and without pleats as well. So we just have to create a front piece that doesn't have pockets. So I've got my pocket piece here and I've got my front piece here, and I'm just gonna tape it together just like we did before for the pleats. Okay, so now I have a whole front piece, there's a whole back piece, and that is all there is to it. So just go ahead, cut those out, and you'll construct them just like they're a pair of pants by themselves, and then I will come back and show you how to insert them into your pants. Right, so I've gone ahead and I have cut out all of my pattern pieces, apart from, well, all the pattern pieces now, apart from the waistband. So you can see that this front piece is 2 inches bigger, in fact, than the original pattern piece. And because I did the cheating method, I don't have a pattern piece to show for it, but it's up to you whether you do that or not. So the first thing I'm going to do is, so I'm not going to really go too much over the sewing because there's the sew along video. So I'm going to fuse my pocket slashes and actually attach, do the full pocket assembly, and then I'll come back and show you how we'll do the pleats. Right, so I've sewn the pocket assembly, so it has some nice red lining. So the whole pocket piece is assembled, and I've got it lying flat. So now we need to make some decisions about where we're going to put the design lines. Remember that we've added in 2 inches, and we already had 2 inches of ease to work with. So we can do a 1 inch pleat, so 1 inch on each side of the pleat, so each pleat is going to be 2 inches in total. Now, what I like to do is do this by eye, and I'm going to actually fold back the seam allowance for the center front. So it's a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so I'm just going to fold that back so I can see the proportions in real life. Okay. So we need to get rid of 1 inch. And so I would say that right now the important design lines that we can see are this slash pocket and then the side seam. So I'm just pinning that out of the way as well. Might just put a pin here just to hold that. Okay, now It's really up to you where you want to put it. But what I would suggest doing is just pinning it and see what you like. So at first what I did with my other pair is I actually measured this, and it's just over 11 inches, and I kind of divided it in half. And I didn't really like the way it looked when it was exactly in half. I think it probably will look best when it's just a little bit further towards the pocket edge. So I'm just using my hem guide, and I'm just kind of slipping that in here so I can get an inch pleat. I'm just making sure I'm pinning that pocket assembly down flat every time. So I can look at that and see how I like that. Actually, that's not too bad. I don't mind that at all. But you know, if I didn't like that, I could say, well, what would it look like here? Okay, what would it look like really close to the center front, you know? Maybe I like that. Or I could say, what would it look like with a reverse pleat? That's a nice look too. I know I've got my 2 inches to work with. I could do an inverted pleat with a release tuck. So I could just squeeze, it'll be a pretty small release. But I could do something like that. So it's really up to you what you decide. I think that I will go for just a normal pleat going the regular direction. And I think I'm gonna have it closer to the pocket edge. So, you know, what you learn in like design school is like the rule of thirds and that kind of thing. So you could divide this up into 3 if you want to, like this expanse here into 3, but then you have this other design line you have to compete with. So does it look pleasing for you to have it in basically thirds? I don't know. It's really up to you. Then what you can do is you can pin that out on both sides and pin it together and then have a look at that flat. So I'm going to do that now. Okay, so I have it pinned out. Sorry for the duct tape. I have it pinned out, and I've pinned the center front seam together to see if I like those proportions, and I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm going to stay stitch along this edge. I didn't stay stitch the pocket down yet. I probably should have said that at the first place, but I haven't stay stitched that down. I'm going to stay stitch all the way along here, and I'm going to stay stitch those side pockets down. And then I'll come back and I'll show you how to do the waistband. Right, so I've sewn up my pants, and I'm going to show you the next steps. So how to insert the lining. So I sewed up the lining just like it was a pair of pants, and because I'm sewing from my stash today, these are blush colored pants with red pocket lining and black lining, but you know, that's the way it goes. So I am going to identify the back and the front. So the back has a higher rise in the Glebe pant, and I'm going to put it so so the finished side goes inside towards the body. So basically wrong sides together. I'm going to put the legs inside, the pant leg inside each pant leg, if that makes sense. And then I'm going to pin the top edges together. Let's get rid of that. Right, so I'm just going to match my seams. This is just a Bemberg lining, and I wanted to make sure that it didn't fray like crazy, so I just actually overlocked it. I didn't didn't sew the seams, I just overlocked it with a 4-thread overlocker. So anyway, so I'm just going to go ahead and pin this top edges of the lining and the pants together. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll do that all the way around, and I'll stay stitch just about a 1/4 inch from the edge. So on the front, you'll see if I match that center front, the lining size fits the front with that pleat sewn in. So that's good, we didn't mess up on our math. Okay, so the fraying was driving me crazy between the lining and this fabric, so I decided to just overlock it together instead of stay stitching it with my machine because it was driving me crazy. Anyway, next step is we have to cut our waistband, so we're just going to measure around so we know how long to cut that. So I'm just going to run my tape measure around just like 1 centimeter in. Okay, bang on 57, which is where we thought it was going to be. So I'm going to cut a waistband 4 inches by 58, so to add seam allowance, so 1/2 inch on each end. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to measure the front. I've cut my waistband. I'm going to measure my front because I need to know how much interfacing to cut. Because we want, the front to stay up nice and straight, we need to interface just the front, but we don't want interfacing where there's going to be elastic. So 26.5. So I'm going to cut a piece of interfacing. I guess it depends how stiff you want it. So it's going to be 26.5 inches long. And then the finished width of the waistband will be 1.5 inches. So you can either do it 1.5, or if you really want it to stay really flat, you could do it 3 inches wide. But I'm going to cut it 1.5 inches wide, I think. So it's my waistband. I've pinned the middle point of the waistband, and I've just made a fold in my interfacing at the middle point. And I'm actually going to fuse my interfacing so that this line of the interfacing is exactly at the halfway, at the fold line. So what you can do if you want is you can press a fold into it, and then use that to guide you in your interfacing. Right, so now I'm going to attach the waistband onto the pants. I actually accidentally cut my waistband just 1/2 inch too short, so I'm going to kind of squeeze it out there and squeeze the seam out. But what you should do is you should attach your waistband into a loop with a 1/2 inch seam here, press it open, and then do this with it in a loop. So I've marked the middle, going right sides together, and I want the interfaced side to be out to the world. So that's on the top edge there. And I'm just going to match the center front seam with the center of that waistband and pin it. And then I'm going to go around and pin the waistband on. So remember that this waistband is sewn on with a 1 centimeter seam. just had a pin in my mouth, which is a really bad habit that I should not continue doing. A friend of mine actually once inhaled a pin, so be careful, it can happen. So this interfacing should end pretty much at the side seam. And I'm going to go around, I'm going to just squeak out a little bit so I can sew my seam next, my back seam. But you should have already sewn that. So what I'm going to do, because I was naughty, is I'm going to sew that seam at a 1/4 inch seam, press it open, finish pinning round, and then I'm going to sew the waistband on with a 1 centimeter seam. Right, I've sewn that 1 centimeter seam. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to press the waistband up, and I'm going to press all of these seam allowances up into that waistband as well. So I'm going to do that first, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to press that waistband fold back in, okay, and then flip it over, and then using this stitching line as a guide, I'm going to fold the edge of this waistband under. It'll be a real scant 1/4 inch. So yeah, so I wanted to actually go over the top of that, because what we'll do then is we'll stitch in the ditch on the outside and catch that seam in, but I'll come back and I'll show you where we're going to do that. So I'm just going to go press now. Okay, so I'm so sorry for the disgusting state of my ironing board. That's what happens when you sew and you have water leaking on it. Try and get a bit of better light there for you. Okay, so I've pressed all of the seam allowances up, and now I've flipped it over. I'm pressing in that existing fold that I pressed in already. And then what I'm going to do, just making sure that that's nice and tucked up, so I'll just show you over here. It's going to be easier, where there's no pocket in the way. Okay, that's better. So pressing in that fold, and then what I'm doing is I'm then tucking all of this up, including all the threads. Now, you can see the stitching line. It's kind of handy that it's very light in color. I am folding this under to a point where it just overlaps by a pin width, I would say. Overlaps that line, and then pressing that in really well. I'm not going to pin it now, because I'm going to sew from the other side and I'm going to stitch in the ditch, but I just need to go through and press that in. So again, using that stitching line as a guide, I want to go just beyond it. You know what's really useful here actually is if you have like pins that don't have a head, you can actually just shove them straight through your ironing board. Whoop, as I can't do it, but anyway, you just pin straight into your ironing board and then just press over the top there, and that's actually really helpful. It's one of the only times it's good to have pins with no heads. You can do it with glass head pins as well, but it's not as good because it doesn't go super flat, doesn't go as flat. I'm going to continue all the way around. Okay, I'm going to do some pinning now. So I'm going to start by pinning the front. So I need to make sure that that's tucked up. And I'm going to stitch in the ditch. So I'm going to pin in the ditch just to make sure I know that it's going to catch the other side. So I'm going to pin just in that ditch there. So this is the side seam. And I'm going to stop sewing in that side seam because that's where I'm going to apply my elastic. So I just pin in the ditch and then I check the back side and make sure that I have caught it. I've just caught it. So kind of living dangerously here, but you know, you gotta live dangerously sometimes. Oops, this is a terrible pin. Not really sure what this fabric is. This is a thrift store fabric. I did a burn test, which I do when I'm not sure about fabric content. However, this one was behaving like a polyester in the burn test, but it does not behave or feel like a pure polyester when I've been working with it. So my experience with like polyester suitings is that they do not press well at all. This presses like a wool. So I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that I think it's a poly wool blend. Probably not like heaps of wool. Like I don't reckon it's like 60% wool. Like it's probably, I don't know, 50% wool or something like that. So there was the very faintest that burning hair smell, but really not much of it at all. And it really was kind of like a polyester. Anyway, in the burn test, that is. So, yeah, inconclusive. Okay, so I'm going to stitch in the ditch, starting at the side seam and going around the front first. Then what I'm going to do is I will stitch in the ditch at the back, but I'll come back and show you how I'll do that. So that's the front waistband finished. You need to go back and check to make sure you've caught that seam in all the way there. Looks like I have, which is excellent. You know, if I hadn't, I would either just catch it down by hand a little bit, or I would just go back over it. Maybe I had not done a good ditch stitch. I'm now going to do the same thing on the back. I'm going to pin it to stitch it in the ditch. However, I'm going to leave a little section open at each side seam. That's so I can thread my elastic through. I've stitched the back waistband down, so now I need to thread my elastic. I have my 1.5 inch elastic here, and I'm just going to put it inside this casing here, and I'm going to thread it just through past that side seam. So I'm going to line that up, make sure it's not at an angle, and make sure it's straight. And I'm going to stitch that down here. Then I will thread it through the rest using a safety pin, and then attach it in the same way at the other end. So I stitched it down like this, and I've got my elastic with a safety pin on. I'm going to thread it through. Okay, and I'm going to come out the other side, pull the elastic through a little bit more than it needs to be. Just going to make sure it's not got any twists or anything in it. It's pretty good. Just going to pull it through a bit more. take that safety pin off. And then I'm going to take this end, be really careful not to lose it, and pop it in to the casing and bring it round past that side seam. And then I'm going to stitch it on that side seam to hold it. The last thing I'll do after that is stitch in the ditch to close up those last holes on just behind each side seam. Okay, here are the finished pants. So made sure I was pressing as I went, and this fabric's pressing really nice. I've got my pleats in here and my elastic waistband, and I have fully lined pants. So I think you'll find with fully lined pants like this, the front and especially the pleats will just hang really well without clinging or poofing out on your body in a weird way. So I think you'll find these pants are lovely to wear because lined pants are beautiful. Anyway, I'm looking forward to seeing what you make from this pattern hack.